This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. This is the third and the final part of our discussion with Gunnar Breivik, who is a professor emeritus at the Norwegian School of Sport Sciences. Professor Breivik's work has been foundational in philosophy of sport, and it was a great honor for me to have him in the podcast, sharing his thoughts and his exciting work. I will briefly sum up the previous episodes in case you haven't listened to them already. Part 1 was an exploration of Heidegger's philosophy and how it can be applied to our thinking around sport. Gunnar shared his work on ontology of the sporting human being, which builds upon Heidegger's philosophy, but also extends into novel, new directions that can help us understand how we find ourselves in the sporting world. In the second part, we discussed Heidegger's notion of authenticity and how Gunnar has used that when exploring skydiving. We also discussed existentialist ideas about breakdown and temporality and how to apply these ideas in sport. And today, in this third and final part of our discussion, we move away from existentialism and focus on ecological sport, which has been one of the key topics of Gunnar's most recent work. Concerns of sustainability are among the pressing concerns of our collective human agenda worldwide. But what would ecologically sustainable and ecologically acceptable sport look like? How much do we need to rethink the way we practice sport, or even the fundamental ideas of sport in our society? Let's listen to what Gunnar has to say. I think now it would be really a nice time point to talking of time. So let's move on a little bit to discuss some of your recent work. You have written about this already a long time ago, but now you have in some of your recent work started to connect sport to these pressing global concerns about sustainability and what is going to happen to our planet as a whole in terms of the environmental crisis. So you've pointed that in sport philosophy, with few exceptions, there hasn't been discussions about what would be an ecologically acceptable or sustainable sport and what would it look like. And so one of the thinkers that you have drawn upon in your own work of exploring this ecologically sustainable sport is the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss. So let's start explorations of that topic area, and you can tell a little bit more about Arne Næss's work on deep ecology.
Well, Arne Næss is very interesting in many ways. First of all, he was a leading international philosopher when he discovered, so to say, the importance of the new science of ecology, which came up in the 60s after Rachel Carson's famous book in 1962 about pesticides and how they changed the world. There was a sort of use of the new system theory of ecology. And Arne became interested in that. He had another also, so to say, root in Spinoza's philosophy, and which is also sort of looking at how everything hangs together in a total whole. And he combined this in many ways and developed things into what he called deep ecology as opposed to shallow ecology. Shallow ecology is when you look at how you can handle superficial pollutions and so on. Deep ecology is a new understanding of how humans are parts of the total. We used earlier nature. Now we would call it environment, which is not so good because then there is the focus of humans in the center, and then we have the environing world around us. But Næss moved on to develop a philosophy where humans are just part of this total ecological system, or nature. Let's call it nature because it's simpler, but we should be aware that it's not nature as different from humans, because humans are part of nature according to Arne Næss, and he also calls this the ecological web. And humans are part of the ecological web on the same level as all other living things. So he argues for an egalitarian approach, which means that all living beings are just knots in the ecological web, and there may be good reasons why we rather kill a fly or an insect or an animal rather than a human being. But in principle, we have equal value and right to live in this ecological web. So it's quite drastic. And he developed also a way of living in nature. We have this tradition of friluftsliv in Norway, which means that it's a way of living with relatively simple means, simple equipment, and where the goal is to experience nature rather than to perform well with specific skills like being very clever at things. It's more like sort of an attitude of a religious or an attitude like artists would meet nature with. So Arne Næss combined these things to developing friluftsliv as something more extreme, in the sense that he wanted to focus on togetherness with nature and in nature, using very simple equipment. He had a very nice slogan: to have richness in ends and simpleness in means, which means that you are able to experience wonderful things, you have deep feelings, but with very simple means. You are able to realize things without costly equipment. So he minimized equipment and developed a way of living in nature where the focus is not on performance, not on sort of doing performances that are admired by other people, but rather try to live with and in nature, follow the rhythms of nature. And it's very similar to Heidegger's later philosophy, where he also focused very much on this being involved with nature, by respecting nature, by not using nature for human purposes, but rather sort of letting yourself become a part of nature. So Arne Næss had a similar idea. He was a famous climber when he was young, and he developed a form of climbing later in life. I was a good friend of him. He was a good friend of mine. So we spent a lot of time together climbing and doing other things. And he developed new ways of climbing that didn't sort of interfere so much with nature, in the sense that instead of using advanced equipment like in the old days, bolts and hammers to hammer bolts into the rock, he now dropped doing that and developed horizontal climbing, where you climb just 1 meter above the ground, and then you find walls that extend in both directions horizontally. Then you can use hundreds of meters of nice climbing just 1 meter above the ground. You should think that there is a 200-meter abyss beyond your feet, so it should be sort of, you should do your best, but not sort of be very focused on performances, but rather on experiencing the nice subtleties then you can find on a rock face, and see all the small living things that are even in small cracks and so on. So it's a sort of ecological climbing, deep ecological climbing, that is it's very interesting. So that has been very interesting for me, and I have tried to develop sort of a more extensive theory using Arne Næss. It's extreme in a sense, but I think that we need also ideas that show the sort of uttermost possibilities of living in nature without destroying nature or interfering too negatively with nature. So I will often be attacked by people who say, well, this is not realistic, and I think it can be inspiring in the sense that it shows what's possible, and then you must find your own way according to your own thinking and your own ideas. But it's inspiring, and for me Arne Næss was very inspiring, so I tried to apply his thinking to sports and also to outdoor life, because that is, as it is now, it's not sustainable at all, so we need to really change.
Yeah, let's go into your theory and your ideas around that in just a second. I think for a moment I'd go back to you were saying about some commonalities in how Heidegger thought about nature and dwelling and Arne Næss. So we know that in Heidegger's later works, such as the question concerning technology, where he's talking about how everything has become resources for us, and we just use the nature as a resource for our projects, and we have kind of lost this other way of being that is probably difficult to put into words what that other way of being looks like, because we are so immersed in our technological worldview. So perhaps you can talk about some maybe similarities and also differences in how Heidegger and Arne Næss think about nature and how they think about meaning and kind of the relationship between nature and meaning.
Well, it's actually many years since I read Heidegger's, the late Heidegger's ideas, but I find that there are a lot of commonalities. I think first Heidegger and Arne Næss, they have this basic idea of not using nature for our own purposes, but trying to respect nature and to become part of nature. It's not, as Arne Næss said, it's you can't conquer a mountain. You can only climb, or you should only climb, if you respect the mountain and you adapt to the mountain. But it's this whole Western sort of way of thinking with conquering and using things for our own purposes. That's the opposite of what both Arne Næss and Heidegger wants. Heidegger talks about, for instance, he talks about Rhine, the river Rhine, and how we put up a hydroelectric plant in the Rhine, and the hydroelectric plant is not put into the Rhine, but as he says, but it's the opposite way. Rhine is put into the hydroelectric plant. So we are setting things up, and we are using nature. So the whole idea of technology is to extract and store resources, as we call it, from nature to be used for human purposes. And he calls this the whole, everything ends up, as it says in German, as a Gestell, which means we could translate it maybe as standing reserve for human purposes. And this is, says Heidegger, not something that we, so to say, as human beings have decided, because in Heidegger's philosophy, it's actually the being that reveals the world and human beings in different ways. So it's this way of revealing, which means that technology is possible. And this is sort of a power that we can't control as we can control other things. So it's not we that are, so to say, the agents or the force behind what is going on, what's being developed, but actually there is the sign, the being that reveals the world in different ways. So this is very difficult to explain, but Arne Næss, he doesn't have this sort of idea of being, because for him it's rather the totality of the ecological system. It's not acting as a sort of a power. There is no being behind that is deciding how the world will develop, but it is all the actors that will make a difference. And therefore, also in sports, it's important to tread lightly on earth, as he says, to be aware of our own position in the ecological web, and be serving instead of conquering. And this is again, when it comes to results, similar to Heidegger's idea of do as they used to do earlier, to respect nature and let nature live. He admires in many ways the old peasants and the way they took care of and respected and developed a way of living that was in accordance with the surroundings. So they both have this idea of not letting the modern attitude of conquering and winning, but rather the attitude of letting be and becoming involved by accepting that one is just a small part of the whole total system. And therefore sports should also adhere to this letting be and being part of, instead of developing more costly and resourceful ways of doing sports. So it's a challenge for all sports people to develop new ways of doing sports, I think.
Yeah, and you said that your ideas about this ecologically sustainable sport are quite radical and idealistic for some. But let's just explore. Can you tell a little bit more about what is your proposal, and be as radical as you want?
Well, I think we need to do two things at the same time. I'm now concentrating on my thinking according to what I have been developing in the last years, listening both to Heidegger and Arne Næss and others, of course. I think I would welcome actually probably more than Heidegger, that we need also what he calls shallow ecology, because we need to start somewhere. So on one hand, we need to get both individuals and groups and organizations and corporations and states and international systems to move on with what is now started. It's about becoming much more acceptable when it comes to handling the biosphere. On the other hand, we also need good examples. We need something that can inspire us. And here Arne, Næss and also Heidegger are important, because they set up ideals where it is to show how it's possible to develop, and how then more and more single individuals and groups and maybe organizations can become as radical as Arne, Næss and Heidegger will show us. So I would welcome that we, in sport philosophy, could find groups of people that were interested in develop this new green sport, a more radical sport, and think about ideas and also practices, and coming together and see how we could practice sports in ways that are inspired by, for instance, Arne Næss, because he has a lot of good examples to give in his own practice of what we could do. For instance, let me show just one very simple example. When he was at his cottage at Tvergastein up in the mountains, he had a cottage where he spent altogether 13 years of his life. And he decided to do some running. So he put on running shoes. He had bought some. And then he started to run a track that he had set up. Took an hour or so. And he tried to run faster every time. So he was occupied with setting personal records. But then he thought, this is stupid, because I maybe run a few seconds faster, but what do I do with these seconds? And I experience so little of the landscape. I'm just focused on my next step and how to run faster. So he dropped the running shoes and put on his old boots, and then he ran very slowly, walking, running. But he experienced what was around him, and experienced the landscape, his emotions and feelings, interaction with everything around him came back. He became much happier. He ran much slower, but enjoyed everything much more. So this is one of many examples of how it changed. He was a very competitive climber when he was young, but it changed his way of doing things and experiencing things, and it was for him a big advantage. And I think for many of us, we should reflect on how we could do things in order to do what we really want to do.
Yeah, and I like the example, and I think often we are too busy running and doing our records that we don't pay attention to the surroundings and kind of how we experience and how we resonate with the world and that green space around us. I guess my question at this point would be then, what is the possible role of competition? Or you said that we should not be focused on using the surroundings as for our own projects and not to be focused on winning. But is there some value in competition in this green sport?
Yeah, I think Arne Næss' example is extreme in a sense, or that we should have no competition at all. That I think is not realistic, and it's not. I like competitions, but we should also develop ways of doing sports with competitions, but without interfering in a negative way with the surroundings, natural surroundings, more than necessary. And if you look at international competitions today with the arenas and resources that are used, it's not possible to go on with this if we are wanting to have a greener planet. So obviously something is wrong with the total sports system, but competition as per se, I'm not negative to that. We haven't talked so much about it, but my basic idea about sport is that it is an exploration of what we can do, and an exploration of our surroundings. So I see sports in these four different directions, as we talked about, the fourfold, as we talked about earlier, but also in general. I think that sport is a wonderful example of how we explore the possibilities of what we can do in our human body. We have, and there is a sort of evolutionary perspective also here that has come up in two recent books also in sport philosophy. It seems that we are more and more taking a look back at, so to say, our evolutionary background. And humans survived by exploring the environment and exploring what they could do with their bodies, and also developed various ways of playing and developing sports as explorations, and we are continuing to do that, and I think that is very fascinating, and therefore I'm fascinated with all the new nature sports, the extreme sport, risk sports, lifestyle sports that have been developed recently, because it shows how the exploration through sporting activities goes on and on. So I'm fascinated with that, and as part of the exploration of different types of sport, I'm also interested in exploring different types of doing sport as competitions, for instance, and developing new ways. So the explorative element is for me very important, whereas if you look at most traditional sports, they have been very static. The old rules are the same rules, the rules today are the same as the old rules. For instance, in a sport like baseball, nothing has changed. You can still look 50 years back and compare the records of today with records of 50 years ago. Maybe this is a little bit extreme example, but they are very traditional. But I like sport as exploration, and therefore I also like exploring new ways of doing green sports, ways of doing sports that are more able to be accepted according to what we need to do to have a deep ecological way of doing sports. So this exploration and competition aspect, I think they are not in opposition to the greening of sport.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice clarification. And what would be, in terms of, if we think of that in a very practical level, we need a change in our sport culture. We need to become more sustainable and more green. What do you think, like in a very practical terms, what would be the first things to do to strive towards that goal?
Well, it depends upon whether you look at the international sports system or if you look at the individual sporting human being or the group of people. I think on the international level, we have for a long time, since the Olympic Games Lillehammer 1994, we had they were called the first Green Games because environmental concerns were part of the setting up of the games. And the Olympic movement have tried to develop guidelines for a more sustainable sport. And these guidelines, I've looked at them, a study I did for some years ago. The guidelines are not bad. They are part of what Arne Næss would call, the more superficial ecological concerns, but nevertheless there is a thinking in the right direction. But when you come to practice, the Olympic movement has not been able to set up very much of practical use that can be guidelining other systems for developing green sports. So the theory is not so bad, but the practice is not necessary. But we need to tighten the screw. We need to make this system function much better. Developing, because the Olympic system is very important, and also the different specific sport organizations. They are different because they reach out. So we need to work on that. But at the same time, there is, instead of this top-down approach, we need also a bottom-up approach, where, as I said, single participants, single performers, single sport persons can develop ways, together with other sport persons of the same mind, develop ways of doing things that can be inspiring. And I think with social media today, these things can spread pretty fast. If you look at Greta Thunberg and how in a short time this developed into a movement among young people in school. We can see the same in sports. If you get people to use the new media and start working together on changing from a sort of bottom up position. So we need both top down and bottom up. We need shallow ecological developments, but we need also deep ecological changes.
Yeah, I think these practical messages are really a wonderful way of wrapping up our discussion today. So once more, I would really like to thank you, Gunnar, for taking the time to talk to me, and I am sure the discussion will be inspirational to a lot of listeners. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this a lot.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.